This video is going to be focusing on the second type of science question that you might find on the ACT, and that is research summaries. Now, research summaries look very similar to data interpretation questions, which I went over in the previous video. Again, you're going to be looking for one or two short paragraph sections, and then usually there's accompanying visuals, graphs, things like that. The only difference is this time the focus is going to be on the experiment itself, not the data that we are getting out of the experiment. So we're going to be really looking at how they ran the experiment and what they did. Now, to identify a research summary question, what you're really looking for is you're looking for tags that say things like experiment 1 versus experiment 2. And that is going to tell you that you're going to be looking at kind of the experimental design that they are looking for. So look for tags like experiment 1, experiment 2. They also might mention things like the name of a specific scientist that you're dealing with. But usually this is going to help you kind of hone in that you're looking at the experiment itself, not necessarily the data that you get through with it. Now, when you are dealing with these kind of questions, research summaries are going to focus on 3 different types of questions. The first one is going to be the one that I keep mentioning, and that is experimental design. So an experimental design question is going to be asking you specifically about why the researcher did certain things. And you're going to be looking at things like controls. You're going to be looking at things like variables. And then the last one that you might find is that it is going to ask you about what's called the hypothesis. Now, these words should look familiar from your science classes, but just to kind of quickly go over them, controls are things that we are intentionally keeping the same during an experiment. Variables are things that are changing during the experiment, whether the scientist changes it, which is the independent variable, or whether it changes in response to something, which is the dependent variable. And then finally, the hypothesis is the educated guess that the researcher is making about how this experiment is going to end. So you might see questions about these 3 things and how the researcher is setting them up. It is also going to want you to demonstrate that you understand the design of the experiment. So why the researcher is doing some of the things that they are doing. So we're going to be looking at the design of the experiment. So that's the first major type of question that you are going to see for the research summary section. The second type of question that you might see is what's called hypotheticals. Hypotheticals are questions about making predictions based on the information that you are getting. So this is really similar to, in the last video, I discussed the concept of trends, being able to make predictions based on what you are seeing. Hypotheticals are going to have an extremely similar situation. And I'll show you an example of a hypothetical in a minute. The other type of experiment, question type that they might ask you to do is called interpretation. An interpretation question is nothing more than, based on the data that you are given, is a hypothesis supported? So basically you have to take a look at the data, and so based on the data from the experiment, you get to say yes or no to whether a statement is supported, and then you are going to have to tell why. Now let me go ahead and give you an example of those 3 question types based on a simple experimental design. So what I have here is a very simple evaporation experiment. I did two experiments, experiment 1 and experiment 2. And once again, I told you those are the labels to look for a research summary. So once again, I have experiment 1 and I have experiment 2 here. And if I was to write out a simple paragraph for this, I would say I've got 2 cups of water. They both start with the exact same amount of water. I put them, one is at 20 degrees Celsius, one is at 30 degrees Celsius, and I'm going to see how the temperature is affecting the rate of evaporation. So I've already kind of got this thing set up for an experimental design. If I am looking for things like controls, variables, and hypotheses, I might say my hypothesis is that the higher the temperature, the faster it is going to evaporate. That is what I'm testing. Now, I have a control variable here. Both of my experiments start at 20 milliliters of water. So I am starting with the same amount of water in both experiments. That is a control. If I'm talking about variables, my major variable here is going to be the temperature. My independent variable is the temperature that I have the room set at. The dependent variable is going to be the change in the water as the experiment goes on. And then finally, I've already gone over my hypothesis, and you should expect a question about the design understanding. But once again, basically, I just have an experiment where I'm changing the temperature and I'm seeing how that affects evaporation. So that would be the first type, the experimental design type passage. The second type would be your hypotheticals. Make a prediction based on trends. If I'm looking at my data as it stands, I see that at 20 degrees Celsius, my decrease is every minute I'm losing 2 milliliters of water. At 30 degrees Celsius, every minute I'm losing 4 milliliters of water. So this one is losing water faster than this one. That is the trend that I am setting up. So if I was to say do this experiment again, but this time at 40 degrees Celsius, based on the data that I see here, I should be able to say I'm expecting an even greater rate of evaporation, maybe 5 or 6 milliliters per minute. So that would be kind of interpreting the trends. That's a hypotheticals type question. Now finally, let's talk about the interpretation. Based on the data, what solution is supported? You might find yourself with a statement that says temperature does not affect rate of evaporation, and you have to either agree or disagree based on the data that you see. Now, based on the data from this experiment, you should be able to see that temperature does in fact change the rate of evaporation. I have a slower rate of evaporation over here. I have a faster rate of evaporation over here, and the only thing that I changed was the temperature of the room that it was in. So you should be able to make the argument for why that is the way it is. And those are your research summary type questions.